So far, we've been learning how to distill arguments and to analyze them by identifying the premises and conclusion as well as any implicit premises that exist in the argument. What we're going to do now is turn a page in our class and begin a new unit in which we start discussing propositions in greater detail. Now, I talked about propositions in the very first or the very second video lecture, the very first one when we started talking about arguments. And what I said then, I'm going to repeat a little bit of now. We're going to go into a little more detail, but what I said then is that propositions are what a sentence expresses and bears the sentence's truth value. And the next couple slides are going to be a little bit of review, but I'm going to have some more to say about them. But a proposition is basically the meaning of a sentence. And here I'm drawing a distinction between a sentence and the proposition. Think of the sentence as the physical symbols. Think of like a word, like a particular sound, like, I don't know, man. That sound, it has a meaning. What is a man? Classic definition is rational animal. That's how Aristotle defined it. So we can distinguish the meaning of a word versus the sound or the physical representation of the word. Same thing with a sentence. And as I said in that video lecture before, you can think of it this way, as how you can have two different sentences like it is snowing and il est neige, and yet they express the exact same proposition. Now, studying propositions is going to be very important because a proposition is basically the most basic unit of thought that we have. Arguments are composed of propositions, be it premises or the conclusion. All of those are propositions. And we need to understand propositions in greater detail because basically by understanding propositions, we understand the meaning that is being expressed through the use of language. And some of this is going to remind you of English class a little bit and what we're about to say, but it's highly important, like I said, just so that we can analyze arguments in greater detail. Now, as I said in the first lecture in which we talked about propositions a few weeks ago, propositions bear truth value. And what this basically comes to is that propositions, they are either true or they are false. There's going to be one truth value or the other. Now, as it turns out, some propositions, they're just eternally true. They're always going to be true. For instance, 1 plus 1 equals 2. That's just always true. But it does have a 1 plus 1 equals 2. That sentence, if you think of it that way, it is always true. Or everything is identical with itself. Well, that's just a sentence that expresses a proposition which is always true. It is always true that everything is identical with itself. Or you may have heard, wherever you go, there you are. It's kind of a silly thing to say. Why is it silly? Because it's just always true. Other propositions are going to always be false, which is something like I exist and I don't exist at the same time and in the same respect. I both exist and I don't exist. Well, that's just always false. It's a self-contradictory statement. So the point here is that propositions, they do have a truth value. Now, some propositions, their truth value changes over time. For instance, I might say, it is raining. Well, that statement would be true when it is in fact raining. That statement, if I say it is raining and it's a clear sunny day, that statement is not true. It is raining changes its truth value depending on where you are. There's a funny joke here. Actually, when I was a little kid and you wanted to really miss school during the winter due to a snowstorm, my dad, he would, just to mess with us, he'd go look out the window and say, "It's snowing," and we'd run to the window in excitement. And then he'd say, "In Alaska," and just to kind of mess with us. But that's a statement too. It is snowing. It's just like I was saying before. It changes its truth value depending on where and what is going on, where you are and what is going on at the time. But I'm belaboring this point because it's really critical to keep in mind that a proposition does have a truth value. Either it's going to be true or it's going to be false. And not all sentences, I said this before, express propositions. For instance, if I ask a question, "Where are you going?" Well, that is an English sentence, but it's neither true nor false. It has no truth value whatsoever. It is a question. Questions do not express propositions. Or a command. don't sit there, that's neither true nor false. Or if I say hello, that does not express a proposition either. So this is one of the first important features about propositions to keep in mind, is that you only encounter a proposition, or a proposition is only expressed by a sentence that is going to be either true or false. So it's going to have some truth value or another. Propositions form a complete thought, and this was something I said in the previous lecture in which we talked about this, is so propositions must have a subject and they must have a predicate. And here are some examples of non-propositions. Something like, although Jones confessed to the crime. All right, well, that seems to be meaningful, but in reality, it's not a complete thought. Although Jones confessed to the crime, ... it's not expressing a complete thought. Anything that begins to exist, again, not a proposition, because anything that begins to exist doesn't express a complete thought. So you couldn't say anything that begins to exist and ascribe a truth value to it. You couldn't say that's false, because you haven't said enough to ascribe truth value to it at all. You haven't said enough to say something that is going to be true or false. If Harry goes to the store, again, it wouldn't make sense to say, if Harry goes to the store, well, that's a false thing to say. It's neither true nor false, because you haven't made any kind of declarative statement about the way the world actually is. So, again, this is a second important feature of propositions, is that they must have a subject, and they must have a predicate, and they form a complete thought. Now, what we're going to study moving forward is how do we identify propositions, because it's a little trickier than you might think. And again, the reason we're doing this is we're trying to ultimately to understand how to distill arguments better. Not only that, but because we do think in sentences, or we think in propositions, you might say, it's going to be important to see not only be able to distill arguments and to evaluate arguments and to analyze arguments, but just to see how are propositions related to one another. For instance, if one proposition is true, must another proposition be true? Or if one proposition is false, will another proposition be false? So we're going to want to see, for instance, logical dependency between propositions. So that's a second important reason we're going to study them. But like I said, we have to be able to identify them in order to study them. And I'm going to highlight a couple important ways that we need to go about identifying propositions. And the first thing I say about identifying propositions is that in order to specify the proposition that's being uttered, we have to first eliminate metaphorical language. And metaphorical language is just basically, as I say up here on the PowerPoint slide, is non-literal meaning. And we actually speak in metaphors all the time. This is a very common thing, and it's kind of a source of eternal frustration for me, because the reality is that most of the time people speak in very loose, imprecise ways, and ways that what they're saying is, I don't want to say meaningless, but the meaning is so opaque, it's virtually meaningless. And I'll just give you one example. Someone says life is a party. What exactly are they saying? If you're just really, I mean, you might hear this. Someone says, or like Shakespeare, all the world is a stage. All right. I mean, that's a metaphorical way of speaking. But we're going to focus on this example. Life is a party. What exactly is this person saying? Like, seriously, what is the proposition that they're trying to communicate? And the reality is there are any number of propositions that this may express. It might mean life is enjoyable. I mean, I guess, because parties are enjoyable. Or you might say life is fun. Maybe that's what they mean, because parties are fun. You should enjoy life. Maybe that's what they're meaning. Or life isn't serious, because parties, I don't know, maybe unless you're a professional party goer or something, but it could mean any number of different things. And this is the problem with metaphorical language, is if we're really trying to study, for instance, an argument, or we're really trying to study even, let's say, some thesis a person is putting forward, we can't understand that when it's expressed in metaphorical language, because it could refer to, the metaphorical language that is, could refer to any number of different things. And we've already studied validity a little bit in this class, And as you know, when you're trying to figure out whether or not a deductive argument is valid or invalid, I mean, you have to actually know what they're saying. Because if a person slides ever so subtly from one proposition to the next, that could completely affect whether or not the argument is valid or invalid. And this is the problem with using metaphorical language. The key terms being used here. So let's assume that we know what life it means when we're saying this, but when we say life is a party, when we predicate the property of partiness, when we describe life as a party, think of like the meaning of the word party in that case as forming a kind of cluster concept. There are a lot of different ideas that we could be trying to pick out, and so because the word party represents a wide array of different ideas, we have just any number of distinct propositions that we might be trying to communicate, and so that makes understanding what exactly the person is saying very difficult. So number one thing you have to do when you're identifying a proposition, eliminate any kind of non-literal meaning. Secondly, this important point about identifying propositions is that even if two sentences are composed of different words, they express the same proposition as long as the words have the same denotation. Now, this is something you may have learned in your English class, but the denotation of a word is the word's literal meaning, whereas the connotation of the word are going to be any kind of positive or negative associations that come up with the word. So, you think about, for instance, like a word like police officer, right? Think about that, and then think about, well, what kind of associations does the word police officer bring to your mind? Or what if someone says cop, call somebody a cop? Think about that word. Well, technically, cop and police officer have the same literal meaning, but there might be different word associations that come to mind when you hear that. It's like so-and-so, you say, I don't know, I've heard people describe others negatively. They'll say, oh, don't be such a cop, right? Maybe someone will say something like that. But I've never really heard someone say, don't behave like a police officer, because you think police officers got a somewhat more dignified meaning behind it. And we see this with a lot of words. As one word will have certain kind of positive associations, another word might have negative associations. And when we talk about these positive or negative associations, we're referring to the connotation of a word. Now, when we're trying to identify the proposition that a certain sentence expresses, we focus on the denotation of the word. We focus on the denotation. What we try to do is ignore any kind of positive or negative associations, and we determine whether or not two propositions are the same, just in case they have the same literal meaning. So, for instance, here's an example. Jack is a good lawyer. Jack is a good attorney. Now, I don't know, enough to know if these words have different associations. You call someone an attorney, call someone a lawyer. I don't know if really there's any difference in positive or negative there. But, these express the exact same proposition. Even though the language is slightly different in these. A lawyer and attorney, those just aren't the same words, but this is a clear example of expressing the same proposition. Now, compare this with something like Jack is a good Christian versus Jack is a good Baptist. Now, some of you might not know, but Baptist is a particular denomination within Christianity. At the broadest level, Christianity divides into Catholic and Protestant. Then within Protestant, you have Baptists, Methodists, Episcopalians, Anglicans. So you have, holiness, a whole bunch of, keep going, non-denominational. You have a whole bunch of different types of Protestants. So saying Jack is a good Christian, well, that's basically saying, a Christian is a very broad term. And that could include, anything from Roman Catholic to Greek Orthodox to Protestant. Whereas Baptist is a very focused term. It would be something like saying Jack is a good scientist versus Jack is a good biologist. All right, these are just different meaning. These words have different meanings, and for that reason, in this particular instance, Jack is a good Christian versus Jack is a good Baptist. Those actually express different propositions. I want to give you a few more examples just so you can see what's going on here. This is just repeating what I just said. The first example I provide same proposition, second one, different ones. But let's look at some more examples. Sam is thrifty versus Sam is stingy. Now, in this instance, think about the word thrifty and think about the word stingy. Do they have any kind of different associations in terms of positive or negative? And to me, it seems like the word thrifty is a positive term. You know, if you're calling someone thrifty, you're like, oh, they're smart, they're frugal with their money, they don't spend it on frivolous things. But saying someone is stingy, I mean, that seems to have some kind of negative association with it. And so, oh, they're stingy. You know, they wouldn't part way with a nickel unless they have to. These words, one has a positive spin and one has a negative. But literally speaking, is there a difference between the word thrifty and stingy? Like, literally, do they have any kind of literal difference in their meaning? And the answer to that is, I don't believe so. And these actually express the same proposition. And like I said, when we're trying to determine whether or not two sentences express the same proposition, what we have to do is dispense with the negative and positive associations of a word and then focus on the literal definition. And you might say, well, why do we do that? Well, because the truth is, whether or not words have positive or negative associations is so up for grabs. It'd be hard to have any kind of, for want of a better term, any kind of like objective science of logic if we were focusing on positive or negative things. Because, you know, what if you hear the word like sunlight, right? I have negative associations with sun because I get sunburnt really easily. So when you hear the sun's coming out, I think, oh God, no, I'm going to get a sunburn. But you might think, yes, I'm going to get a good tan or something. So, you know, this is why I'm saying what we have to do is focus on literal meaning, because these positive or negative associations, they're so subjective in a way that we really can't have any kind of objective study of logic if we're going to focus on those. So instead, we focus on the literal meanings of the words. And in this particular case, these express the same proposition. Right, let's look at another example. Mark is incompetent versus Mark is a beginner. Now, here the key terms are incompetent and beginner. And you have to ask, do these mean the same thing? And the answer to that is, I believe, no. To say someone's a beginner is just to say they're starting out at something. And probably most beginners aren't going to be proficient in what they're doing. But to describe someone as incompetent, it just means that someone is not only not good, they're subpar for what they're doing. And people can be incompetent and have been doing something for a long period of time. These words don't have the same meaning. And so in this case, we actually have two different propositions being expressed. This is a little tricky at times because, you know, sometimes the meanings of words, there's a fine line between does word A mean the same thing as word B? It can be really tricky at times, but you have to do your best to figure out, do these words have the same literal meaning? Ignore any kind of positive or negative associations and focus on literal meanings when we're trying to determine if the two sentences express the same propositions. All right, third point about identifying propositions is that sentences that are grammatically different may express the same proposition. So let me give you an example because this will help clarify. The Braves beat the Mets expresses the same proposition as the Mets were beaten by the Braves. Notice here that the first sentence, some of you might remember, this is in what's called active voice, whereas the second sentence I've listed is in what's called passive voice. So grammatically, these sentences are different, but they mean the same exact thing. You know, I know your English teachers tell you to always avoid the passive voice, which you can understand why. It just kind of makes the meaning of what you're saying a little hard to figure out sometimes. But these mean the same thing, even though they're expressing that proposition differently. The proposition is the same, it's just the grammar is different. And this is something that is quite common, is that people will say the same thing, but they'll just word it a little differently, or they'll restructure their sentences a little differently, even though they're saying the same thing. Here's another example. Jane performed better than Carl on the test. Carl performed worse than Jane on the test. Now you hear this, and at first you might be a little unclear about what's being said. I guess with the second sentence, Carl performed worse than Jane. Well, that means that Jane performed better than Carl. These express the exact same proposition. They express the same proposition, even though grammatically, and even when it comes to the word choice here, the words are different, but they're still saying the same thing. So you probably saw some of this when I was distilling arguments, as I'd say, okay, well, here's what the author said, but we can restructure what they've said in this way that'll make it a little more efficient and easier to follow. That's perfectly fine. Sometimes when you're distilling an argument, let's say, the person has said something and it's kind of cumbersome, you're like, okay, well, we can simplify their prose. And that's fine to do as long as your reconstruction of what they said, it is still expressing the same proposition as before. Now, as I say right here, point number 3, sentences that are grammatically different may express the same proposition, but sometimes the grammar can affect the proposition that is expressed. Sometimes sentences that are grammatically different actually do express very, very different propositions. So look at these two sentences right here. The Japanese who eat a lot of fish are healthy, and the Japanese who eat a lot of fish are healthy. Did you catch the difference there? The Japanese who eat a lot of fish are healthy, and the Japanese who eat a lot of fish are healthy. What is the difference between these two sentences? Well, it seems like the first sentence is talking about just a small group of people. It's talking about the Japanese who eat a lot of fish. So it's talking about a particular class within the Japanese people. So you can think about it in the following way. It's like, all right, let's say we had a large circle representing all Japanese people. And then you had a smaller circle within that, and that smaller group, that was specifically referring to those particular Japanese who eat a lot of fish. And what the first sentence is saying is that particular group that eats a lot of fish, they happen to be healthy. And it's not saying anything about all the rest of the Japanese people. Now, the second sentence up here, though, is saying the Japanese who eat a lot of fish are healthy. And this is making a claim about all Japanese. It's saying all Japanese eat a lot of fish and all Japanese people are healthy. And the grammar here is really important to pay attention to because it affects the proposition that's being expressed. And that phrase this I have in red up here, who eat a lot of fish, and the first sentence, it's what's called a restrictive clause because it's restricting the reference of the people or the term. Sorry, let me back up again. It's basically restricting the reference of who we're talking about. The term in the first sentence, the people, let me back up, who eat a lot of fish. That is restricting who we're talking about. We're not talking about all Japanese people. We're talking about specifically those who eat a lot of fish. Whereas in the second sentence, who eat a lot of fish, that phrase is a non-restrictive clause. It's basically a clause that does not restrict the reference of the term it modifies. So if you notice, say the term it modifies, in both sentence 1 and sentence 2, who eat a lot of fish, that's modifying this other term, the term being the Japanese. In the first sentence, it is restricting the Japanese people we're talking about. And the second sentence, it's not restricting the Japanese people we're talking about. And so this is a really important lesson because as we try to figure out what propositions are and are not being asserted or expressed, we have to pay attention to these kinds of clauses. What effect do they have? Do they restrict who we're talking about, or do they not restrict who they're talking about? Now, I want to make one more point about non-restrictive clauses, and this might have escaped you, but when we talk about non-restrictive clauses, so let me go back a slide, which is the ones down here at the bottom, what is going on is that it is actually enabling that sentence. So this sentence right here, the Japanese who eat a lot of fish are healthy, it's actually setting it up so that it expresses more than one proposition. This proposition right here, or this sentence I should say, the Japanese who eat a lot of fish are healthy, is not expressing a single proposition. It's expressing two distinct propositions. It's saying the Japanese eat a lot of fish, and then it's also saying the Japanese are healthy. So when we go back to the restrictive clause, this sentence right here, the Japanese who eat a lot of fish are healthy, that's a single proposition that's being expressed. But in the second example, we're actually expressing not one, but two distinct propositions. And these two distinct propositions, as we've worded it right here, it might not be clear that, we're saying two things simultaneously. But this is something that's interesting to point out. We could say this sentence right here, or we could word it differently and say, the Japanese eat a lot of fish and the Japanese are healthy. And that's the way I just worded it is perfectly equivalent to what is being said here. You could say the Japanese who eat a lot of fish are healthy, or you could express it differently and say the Japanese eat a lot of fish and the Japanese are healthy. And you notice in the second way I've expressed it, grammatically it's said differently, but it's still saying the exact same thing, or let me rephrase that, it's still expressing the same two propositions. So I'm mentioning that just because as we move forward and we're identifying propositions that sentences express, we have to be clear. If we run across a sentence like this, it's like, well, what proposition does that express? And we need to be careful and technical here and say, well, technically it doesn't express a single proposition. It actually expresses two distinct ones. And the reason this is important to note is because when we're trying to evaluate what things are saying or even analyze them further, we're going to say, well, if I don't agree with this sentence right here, which proposition do I disagree with? Do I disagree with one? Do I disagree with two? Or if we're trying to understand, well, if this statement is true right here, what does it lead to? What does it entail? And in order to figure that out, we'll have to know, well, what are the two distinct propositions that compose it? If we're going to figure out what it entails or what it leads us to know based on it. So this is a pretty short video lecture, and I'm going to go ahead and post your homework online. I know this might look like a lot here because you have 20 different problems you have to do, but I think this will go pretty quickly. A lot of it is just determine if these two sentences express the same proposition, and I think you can go through it roughly pretty quickly. So you don't look at this and feel overwhelmed like, oh my God, he's assigning 20 some odd problems, because I think this, even though there may be more total number of problems than some of the previous assignments, I think it'll actually probably end up going a little bit faster. If some of what I went over was a little confusing, do make sure to read the pages I've listed up here, because it'll go over this information, maybe explain it a little bit differently so that you can understand what we're talking about. But this is, like I said, we're going over propositions because this is going to be actually the next big lesson we cover. The big unit we're going to cover is going to spend a lot of time talking about different types of propositions. And I'll say more about this next class, but as it turns out, there are actually different types of logics that exist for the different types of propositions we encounter. So please do give special attention to these problems, because it is going to be the foundation of everything we study, not only in this unit, but actually for the rest of the semester.